I don't know if anybody remembers this, but today is September 11th. 15 years ago today, our country was attacked. I can vividly remember where I was that morning.
Me too.
I was working at the hospital back then, and I was off that morning, but we had a meeting. We had a class we had to go to. So I was up getting ready for the class, and a friend of mine called on the phone and said, "Turn on the news. Are you watching the news?" I said, "No, what's going on?" He said, "Turn on the news," and he hung up. I found out later so he could call a bunch of other people. So I turned on the news, and it was right before the second plane hit the second tower. And I couldn't stop watching. I absolutely could not stop watching. And I knew I had to get to this meeting, and I started getting ready. And I got in the truck, and I started driving in. I lived out here in Chino at the time, so I had a 30-minute drive into Prescott. And I never do this, I actually put NPR on my radio in my truck, because that was the only station that was broadcasting live information that was going on. When I got there, I parked, but I couldn't turn the radio off because I was afraid I was going to miss something. I was like in a fog. Finally went upstairs and went in the building, and everybody, all the staff, is gathered in a couple of these empty patient rooms at the end of the hallway with the TV on. And we're all crammed in there watching this on TV. The person who was supposed to do the meeting showed up to the meeting room, and there was nobody there. So she came and found us, and she started watching the TV. She couldn't leave either. Eventually, after a few minutes of that, she just said, "Everyone go home, be with your families, do what you need to do." It was a terrible day. It really was. It's only fitting to remember what happened 15 years ago. When those planes hit the Trade Center, the Pentagon, and that field in rural Pennsylvania, the stories that came out of there were awe-inspiring. They were tragic. It still brings some emotion out of me today. The Holocaust survivor motto is never forget. We need to remember these things. We need to not forget these things. If you grew up in Texas, like my wife, remember the Alamo still means something after all these years. It's more than just a casual saying. These events, the memories of these events trigger emotions like fear, sadness, anger, hatred, or perhaps they do fill us with some feeling of pride, courage, and hope because of how people have responded. Conflict, war, and bloodshed, and state-sponsored terrorism is nothing new. It's been around since there were people. And ancient Israel had their fair share of battles on this front. And back then they had a giant problem. Oh wait, I said that wrong. What I meant to say is they had a giant problem. So let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Find out about Israel's giant problem. This is a very familiar story to most of us. But just as remembering 9/11 is a right thing to do, sometimes as we get further away from it and we get so familiar with those events, we kind of lose some of the impact.
What chapter?
17? 1 Samuel 17? So I'm just going to catch you up on where we're at in Scripture just a little bit. Israel has been at war with the Philistines and most of their other neighbors, all of the ites that we read about, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the termites, and the mosquito bites. There's a bunch of ites in there, and Israel's at war with all of them. King Saul, who was Israel's first king, has just beaten the Philistines back to their own borders. But now God commissions him to go take on the Amalekites. The Amalekites had obstructed Israel from possessing the land. And this was now God's time to have a little payback with the Amalekites. And he told King Saul to utterly destroy them. God said, kill everything that moves, destroy everything. Man, women, children, livestock, property, destroy the whole place. Raze it to the ground. Saul's got a better idea. Saul does kill all of the people, but he spares the king, Agag, and he keeps the best of the livestock and a bunch of the valuable stuff as spoils of war. The prophet Samuel confronts Saul, and Saul makes some lame excuses. You ever done that? Get caught doing something you weren't supposed to do, and start making lame excuses. I am the king of bad excuses. It's something God has healed me up to some degree, but every once in a while I catch myself making up lame excuses. Ultimately, because of Saul's disobedience, God removed his anointing as king. And he also afflicted him with an evil spirit. In the meantime, God sent Samuel to anoint the new king, who was a young guy. There was a shepherd in Bethlehem. His name was David. The only thing that helps soothe Saul from his evil spirit, we don't know what the affliction was. Maybe he had terrible migraines. He might have some kind of mental illness. We don't know what it is. But the only thing that would help is music. And one of his servants said, hey, I know a guy. And Saul sends his servant to go talk to the guy, who turns out to be, you guessed it was David. We don't know if Saul knows anything about David being his replacement yet. It appears that he doesn't, because as we read on later, he takes it personal and tries to take care of that problem himself too. But in the beginning, he takes a liking to this young kid, and he keeps him around. He gives him a job as his armor bearer. So now we pick up the story. 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in lines of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Now, I do better if I can see things, so I'm just going to catch you guys up here. Azekah is here, Sokah is here, and for reference, Jerusalem's here, Bethlehem's here, and the Dead Sea's off over here on the wall. So, yeah, about there. Okay, so we are zooming in, satellite view. They didn't have us back then, but I love satellites and drone footage. It's awesome. So in this valley right here, Israel's on this side of the valley, and the Philistines are camped out right there. And this gives you kind of a view from Azekah, so we're looking toward the southeast. So Saul's over here, Philistines are there, and then you've got this valley and a creek running through it. Okay, so now you kind of got an idea of what it looked like. And that was kind of a common thing, that you'd want the high ground and you'd have a valley between you, and you dare the other guy to charge up the hill and try to get you. Verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, 6 cubits and a span, that roughly equates to 9 feet 6 inches. Then also the Septuagint, which is the oldest copy of the Old Testament that we have, says he was 4 cubits in a span, which makes him 6'6". But either way, he was bigger than most people at that time. The average guy was about 5'5". So he was a big guy, and I don't want to get too hung up on, was he 10 feet tall or was he 7 feet tall? Doesn't really matter in the whole sequence of events here. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat of mail and the weight was 5,000 shekels of bronze, which is about 125 pounds. Now, a medieval suit of armor that they would wear in combat weighed about 60 pounds. And for jousting purposes, they beefed those up. It was basically whatever the horse could carry. And those weighed as much as 110 pounds. So that's not really out of the question for being able to wear suit armor and being able to move around. A soldier today carries a 60-pound pack. So, 80? Okay, I'll buy that. So that's not an outrageous amount of gear for a guy this size. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam or a fence post, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. 600 shekels, that's about 15 pounds. So this guy had a javelin, which was a skinny weapon slung on his shoulders for throwing. He had this huge fence post with a 15-pound spear on it for thrusting and jabbing you. Wow. We're told later he's packing a sword, and he's got another guy carrying a shield out in front of him. How would you like to be that guy? The biggest target on the battlefield, and I'm holding his shield. Not a good job. Okay, so he's a big dude, and he is decked out to go kill something. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, verse 8, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. This was not an uncommon thing, to have your champions go fight and whoever won. That would be like if, we sent President Obama over to Afghanistan to duke it out with Osama bin Laden. Wouldn't that have been easier?
A lot easier.
A lot easier.
A lot better.
Yeah, I wish we did that today. It would solve a lot more problems. There'd be a lot less leaders picking fights, too.
Be a lot less soldiers losing.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the word dismayed and greatly afraid, dismayed can be translated from the Hebrew as they were broken, they were shattered, confused, no idea what to do. They were terrified and demoralized. Sound a little bit like 9/11? I know I was. So that's the way they felt back then. They didn't know what they were going to do, but they just knew they were going to lose. Verse 12, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem." So David's going back and forth. Bethlehem is about 17 miles from where the battlefield is. So he was going back and forth between the battlefield to play his harp for Saul and to take care of his chores at home, because he still had chores. He took care of the sheep. And for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. Verse 17, "And Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah, which is about 6 gallons of dry measure, or 30 pounds. So take an ephah, and there we go. Take an ephah of this parched grain. Parched grain was just grain that had been dried out. That's something that they ate back then. It would be kind of equivalent to corn nuts today. And then these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their thousands, which would be their colonels in our language. If your brothers are well, see if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. So go take this food to your brothers, see what's going on, give the colonels some stuff, so the good stuff, and then bring me back some news of what's going on. Make sure they're okay, and tell me what's going on. Now Saul, verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, so he drops everything and says, watch this for me, and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. He wants to find out what's going on. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. But this time David heard him. This guy's been doing this morning and evening for 40 days, and apparently David was taking care of the sheep. So he hasn't seen this guy yet. So this is David's first exposure to this Goliath guy taunting everyone. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the man who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? So these guys are saying, whoever kills this guy is going to shoot right up to the top. The king's going to give him everything. You marry his daughter, you get property, you get riches, you get famous. And David said, what? So David continues, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. They didn't answer David's question. David didn't ask, what's Saul going to do? He asked, who's this guy that everybody's so afraid of and is defying the living God? Who is this big mouth, and why hasn't anybody done anything yet? Now, Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? What'd I say? What? I'm not just here. Dad told me to come bring you guys stuff and see how you're doing. This guy started mouthing off. That's all I'm doing is seeing what's going on. But his brothers started to get a little snippy with him. And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. So David still, he still has to do what are we going to do with this guy? And they're saying, oh, well, if you kill him, you get all this stuff. And David said, no. What are we going to do about this guy? You're just going to let him badmouth God? So when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul. And he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Wait a minute, nobody wants to. I'll do it. I'll do it. Because God is worth fighting for. It's worth getting this big mouth to shut up because he's bad-mouthing God. God is worth fighting for. And Saul said to David, verse 33, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. If a lion or a bear tried to steal a sheep, I'd hit him. And if he turned on me, I'd grab him by the jaw and I'd kill him. And God gave me the power to do that. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he's defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Good luck, buddy. You know, I guess I'll have to find a new harp player, but you go right ahead. You know, Saul was not a slouch himself. And he didn't want anything to do with this guy, and neither did anyone else. So he said, okay, kid, rock on, you know, have fun. And you know how it works out for you. In verse 38, we continue. And Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. So one of the great misconceptions of this story is that David's this little kid, and Saul gives him his armor to put on. Well, would it not be ridiculous if I gave Leroy my clothes and said, hey, go out and do something really strenuous and don't trip yourself up on it? You know, here's my pants. See if you can get them to stay up while you're running around while somebody's trying to kill you. It just doesn't make sense. 1 Samuel 9:2 tells us that Saul was a big guy, a head taller than everyone else. I said earlier the average height back then was 5'5". So Saul was probably close to 6 feet tall. That's just a guess. And why would he give David his armor if it wouldn't fit him? You know, he's not stupid. That doesn't make any sense at all. So David was not this tiny little thing. He was just a kid, but he was a big kid. He was just not used to wearing cumbersome armor. It would slow him down. His best weapon was going to be his speed and agility. And big guys don't move as fast as little guys. That's just the law of physics, especially a big guy wearing a bunch of stuff that's slowing him down. So most likely the armor that Saul offered David was a pretty close fit. David just chose not to. Now when I back in my younger years, I used to be a volunteer firefighter. And we had to wear the full turnout gears and air packs and the whole 9 yards. And I'll tell you what, it was miserable moving around in those until you got used to. So, and it was still no fun, but when you first put it on, you couldn't move. You were like the kid in A Christmas Story with the coat. I can't put my arms down. Yes, that's the way you felt. So David knows that he's going to be fighting for his life. He doesn't want to be slowed down with all this stuff. He doesn't have the time for the learning curve to figure out how to use it. That'll come later. And also, 1 Samuel 16, 17 through 19, the previous chapter says, so Saul says to his servants, provide for me someone who can play well and bring him to me. One of the young men answered, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite who is skillful in playing. He's a good musician. He's a man of valor. He's a warrior. He's prudent in speech and a man of good presence. And the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David who's with the sheep. David already had a reputation as being a kind of a tough guy. He also had a reputation of being very close to God. He was a man of God. And Scripture tells us in many places he was a man after God's own heart. Okay. So, pick it up again in verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. Who's this kid, this fresh-faced kid? And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Now, he noticed David was carrying his staff. He totally missed the whole sling thing. He didn't notice that David came armed with something other than a stick. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his God, so he's cussing at him now. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. I will cut you up and leave the pieces here for the birds to eat." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Enough said. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. And that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." So David says, "You know what you just said, I'm going to do it to you and all of your buddies. And it's not just going to be me. God is going to fight the battle. The battle belongs to the Lord. He's already won the battle. All I got to do is keep moving forward." So let's just, I don't know if you guys watch Bear Grylls, Running Wild with Bear Grylls. Kind of an interesting show. We were watching it a few weeks ago, and Bear Grylls had Shaquille O'Neal out in the Adirondacks, and they were doing a thing. That's Bear Grylls, and that's Shaquille O'Neal. Bear Grylls is 6 feet tall. Shaq is about 7'1", 350 pounds. It's an amazing difference what a foot makes in height. Shaq does look kind of like a giant. That's probably pretty close to what David and Goliath looked like. Okay, that's just a point of reference. Okay, in verse 48, we pick it up. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine, and David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it, and it struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So I did a little research, and on a sling, this is an ancient weapon, been around for thousands of years. It looked something like that. It was just a piece of cord with a pouch in the middle. There was a ring around one hand, and you would tie it. You would put the ring through your pinky finger and have the other piece, and you could throw it either underhand or overhand, depending on what you were used to. But a well-practiced person could get pretty accurate with these things. A normal person with modern testing and all of that can throw a stone about 100 feet per second, which equals 67 miles an hour, almost 70 miles an hour. A guy who's really good with it can wing that thing twice that fast, 200 feet per second, which is 134 miles an hour. That's faster than a Randy Johnson fastball. You get hit in the head with that, you're going down. A standard bow will shoot an arrow at about 225 feet per second, which is 25 feet per second slower than a rock. And we all know how dangerous arrows can be. Just by comparison, a Revolutionary War musket can shoot about 400 feet per second, which is about twice as fast as that rock. So he's only throwing this rock half as fast as a musket ball in the Revolutionary War. That's definitely enough velocity to knock somebody out, even a giant. So we continue on. Okay, so he hits him in the head, giant goes down. And in verse 50, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. there was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. Just like he said he was gonna.
Told you so.
Yeah, exactly. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. They ran away. This kid would kill our big dude with a rock and then stole his own sword and chopped off his head with it. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, at the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell away from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. David saved his souvenirs. And if you read further on in the Old Testament, you will find the story about David needed to use Goliath's sword again later. So that's a good story too. I love these stories. So, what am I getting at? We all have our giants. It might be fear, it might be an illness, it might be an addiction, it might be something about us we don't like, it might be something about someone else we don't like. And they don't just show up once. They keep coming back. Morning and evening, day after day. They intimidate us. Is it a problem, a concern, a financial problem, an illness, some fear, something that we just don't know how we're going to handle? Are we going to be shivering in our boots like Saul and the Israelites? We can't figure out what to do with this. It wears us down. Giants that break us down and bring fear and confusion to our minds. We get dismayed sometimes. I know I do. I get really discouraged when the giants, I build them up bigger than they really are, and I forget who's really in charge. If we tolerate our giants, try to ignore them, avoid them, they don't go away. Goliath was not going anywhere. They were there for a month and a half. He wasn't going away. And they just keep coming. And then they move into our houses and into our lives. And then they capture our every thought. They got to take over. We don't have any peace. If we're avoiding that conversation we know we need to have with our kids or our spouse or someone at work, if we're hanging on to some denial about an addiction, some habit we have, something we need to deal with, but we just keep pushing it back. If we hang on to our Goliaths, they won't go away. They just keep coming back. What David knew is that the only way to deal with a Goliath is to kill it. You have to kill it. You have to get rid of it, or it won't leave you alone. What David saw was the army of the living God demoralized by a giant that they should have never hesitated to kill. They waited around until this giant got bigger and scarier, and maybe he started out at 6'6" and he ended up at 10 feet. We are the army of the living God, each and every one of us here. So what do we do? Well, what do people do in mass after 9/11? They prayed like there was no tomorrow. We hung flags. Everywhere you could fit a flag, we put one up. People went to church like we haven't seen in decades. In the days and weeks following 9/11, church attendance rose by some estimates 40%. If your church had 100 people, there was 140 people every Sunday now. A year later, church attendance had slipped back to pre-September 11th levels. What happened? We got used to the new normal. We got complacent. And we forgot. We forgot what we were supposed to remember. Robin Lovin is a theology professor at SMU, Southern Methodist University. And he said people who have not made basic changes in their lives in the days before September 11th found themselves February 11th, March 11th, and April 11th living the same kind of lives they lived before September 11th. If you don't respond to that kind of spiritual crisis fairly immediately with some new priorities and activities, it's not going to be a permanent change. If you let the giant live too long, you won't kill it. You'll let it do whatever it wants. Please do not leave here today and forget that in order to battle your giants, you are going to have to make some changes. The lesson we learn from David isn't really about the old familiar story of the kid killing the giant. The lesson we learn from David is that the battle is not ours. The battle belongs to the Lord. Say it. The battle belongs to the Lord. Whose battle is it?
The Lord's.
Exactly. We try to do this. I do it myself all the time. I try to figure out, how am I going to fix this? How am I going to do this? How am I going to change that? I can't. The battle belongs to the Lord. David knew from past experience that God would do battle for him. He said in verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Period. He didn't say I need a bigger stick or a bigger rock or I'd like to have an M16. He didn't say any of that. Where's my hand grenade? He said, the battle belongs to the Lord. The Lord will deliver me. Period. He didn't have to kill Goliath. He knew God already had that part figured out. He didn't have to kill him. All he had to do was get moving. He actually grabbed 5 stones. Why did he grab 5 stones? He only needed 1. He took him down with 1 shot. Because he wasn't stupid. He went prepared to do battle with a full pouch of ammunition. He didn't know what was going to happen out there. He had no idea God was going to deliver the giant to him with 1 throw of the sling. Our ammunition is our faith. Why say 1 prayer when you can say 5? Why have 1 person praying for you when you can have 5 or 10 or 30? Why do the right thing once when you can have a whole pouch full of right things at your side? You always want more ammunition than you're going to need. I love Pastor James McDonald's definition of faith. I remember hearing this 20 years ago, and it still sticks in my mind today. Pastor James said, believing the Word of God and acting on it, regardless of how I feel, because God promises a good result. Faith is believing the Word of God and acting on it, regardless of how I feel. Am I scared? Am I dismayed? Am I just lost? I don't know what to do. Is everyone around me doing the same thing? Should I follow them? No. Believing the Word of God and acting on it, regardless of how I feel, because God promises a good result. That's how we build up our faith. Through our own experiences and the experiences of others. When God shows up and does something, can you think of a time that God showed up and pulled you through something that you had no idea what you were going to do? It was so overwhelming you had no clue. And God pulled you through that? He'll do it again. That's a faith-building experience when we go through these troubles and struggles and trials and God comes through. Maybe it takes a while. Maybe we have to get out of the way and let Him. And He'll do it again. He just wants you to trust Him. I don't know how many times in the New Testament when Jesus goes to heal someone and He said, your faith has healed you. He didn't say, I healed you. He said, your faith has healed you. It's perfectly and necessary. It's perfectly appropriate to remember September 11th and the Holocaust. It's even okay to remember the Alamo. But the most important thing to remember is that the battle belongs to the Lord. Thanks.